Okay, I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore. And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
So we're talking today about another huaban, which, for anyone who's heard more than a couple of these, is a kind of vernacular short story, sometimes novella, written in the late Ming Dynasty, early Qing Dynasty, which would be 17th to early 18th century.
Yeah.
The one we're looking at today has an awful title. It's called A Male Mencius's Mother Moves Her Son 3 Times.
南蒙母教和三钱.
Yeah. So I tried to think of a different way to translate that name.
There's no
a male Mencius's mother is horrible.
There's no better way to translate it.
There really isn't. No, there's not, unfortunately.
没办法.
没办法, as we say. So this is also written by Li Yu. We've also talked about another of Li Yu's stories, I believe. Mm-hmm. And that would be A Tower for Summer Heat.
Shailo.
Right. He is a very clever writer. He's someone who's very commercial, and at the time wanting to sell his stories. He was also writing at a point when the genre was starting to kind of dry up.
There's a sense that Li Yu had to get very gimmicky. In the story that we talked about before, the Shailo, the story revolves around a telescope. And, there's this newfangled contraption that just entered China, the telescope. And so it's almost like he has to kind of play these games with readers, and maybe earlier huaban kind of didn't have to do that, but with Li Yu, who's very commercially concerned, like you said, but also is writing it towards the end of the genre, everything's been done before, so he has to think of crazier and crazier things to do.
And is surprisingly clever with how he does it.
It's not bad.
He's not a hack job. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah. And I guess we should mention the device that he uses in this story. It's a traditional huaban love story in almost every way, except for one difference.
Which is a big difference.
It's a big difference if you've ever been to Bangkok.
Yeah. Lee's joke will make sense shortly, but I'm going to give the shell of the plot real quick. And it's a disturbing plot to recount, and it's disturbing because there's an assumption that this is for most people, I think, in the modern world, Americans, Europeans, even Chinese, that the modern world, modern meaning right now, sort of has the monopoly on graphic, disturbing, also highly sexualized, provocative stuff.
There's this sense that everything's going downhill. And
exactly,
we're at the end.
Yeah. And then you read Boccaccio, and then you read some of these Chaucer, and you go, oh, wait, no.
Shakespeare.
Nope. Yeah. In this story, in our current climate, with discussions about gender, about sexuality, this story is utterly fascinating.
Absolutely.
Because it was written 300-something, almost 400 years ago now. And
it's so, the questions it asks are so present in today's, in American discourse, I would say.
Yeah, and certainly in China. And what's fascinating is the apex of the story is undeniably disturbing. It's graphic. It's frankly very gross. And yet at the same time, it's extremely clever.
And very touching, I would say.
So the plot. The plot is about two guys, Jifang and Rui Liang. Jifang and Rui Liang are both homosexual males. Now, this term is problematic, of course, at this time because there were the notions of what this was a little different.
Homosexuality, I guess, doesn't really. Literary scholars tend to not talk about homosexuality until we get to the late 19th, early 20th century. Right. So we should probably use the term homoerotic, which is not necessarily exclusively what we would call today gay, but maybe men who are interested in other men sexually, but still willing to kind of do the deed with their wives to participate in reproductive rights.
It's not a practice that's necessarily censured the way it is and was in a lot of other cultures, but...
And I should point out, the first law making homosexuality illegal in China was actually not made until 1912. It's actually copied from Western law codes by the Kuomintang.
So, the story concerns two men, Jifang and Rui Liang.
Man and a boy.
Yeah, man and a boy. Jifang has been married, has a son, his wife dies. Jifang leans toward the homoerotic and is looking for a replacement, but a younger boy. Ray Liang fits the bill. He's incredibly described beautiful. That's the term used, beautiful, attractive, but in a very, we would say, stereotypically feminine way. They are literally married. Ray Liang, as a good filial son, brings his father to live with him. Father dies. Jifeng tells Ray Liang, listen, this is not going to work. Ray Liang says, why? Jifeng says, well, you're young, your penis is very undeveloped, but soon it's going to be developed, and it's going to lead you naturally to want to sleep with women. And so we're going to be finished. Ray Liang says, that's silly. We're going to be together forever. We're in love. This can't be. Jifeng insists, goes off. Ray Liang realizes that if this is going to be the relationship he wants it to be, something has to be done to end sort of the curse of his phallus. So he castrates himself with a razor blade. Yeah, that's the rough part of the story. Jifeng comes home, finds him bleeding. He recovers, and then the case goes to court. Jifeng is executed. And on his deathbed says to Ray Liang, I just want to know one thing from you. I need to know that you're going to take care of my son. And Ray Liang, who after castrating himself actually has now an aperture that functions like a vagina, essentially becomes female.
Right.
Biologically. Female, yeah. Takes the son, raises the son as now her own. And I'm using the pronoun they're using in the story, just for those who are wondering. And raises the son, and in order to prevent the son's being taken away by temptation, moves 3 different times to get the son away from various sensual temptations that would threaten to destroy him, which is a direct reference to a story commonly told about the philosopher Mencius, sometimes called Mencius. And that's the end of the story.
Yeah, great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the gender reference you make that happens in the middle of the story. You said the story actually changes the gender. We should be clear. I don't know that this story has a gender pronoun.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah, I'm wrong about that, actually.
Well, I mean, I don't think you're wrong. I think it's just the difference in Chinese and English as far as a language. So we're not talking about a gender pronoun. Ray Liang actually changes his name, which I think is even more interesting. Ray Liang, so Ray is just, it's a name. I mean, it has some meaning, but Lang literally means lad, like boy, man, kind of L-A-D. But then Ray Liang changes his name to Ray Niang, which means girl. Niang means girl.
Yeah.
So not only is there a social change, there's also a biological change, and that's accompanied with Ray Liang's desire to change his name, which I think is fascinating. You alluded to in that plot summary how this change happens. There's a biological change. During the execution, what actually happens is Ray Liang is stripped of all of her clothes. And all of these perverts in the audience are looking on, kind of wanting to see what happened, because they had all we didn't mention this, they had all been competing with Jifeng. We didn't mention this, but they had all been competing with Jifeng for Ray Liang's love, or whatever that is. And so they're looking on, and they see that this boy has essentially grown a vagina after castrating himself.
So you have this moment that's undeniably grotesque.
Yeah.
And
also,
we said at the outset that it's going to seem grotesque, but that it's actually very cleverly done and raises some interesting questions. One of which is about the question of what makes a good marriage, an ideal marriage in Chinese society.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this marriage is almost exactly like the marriages that we've seen in other stories. The only real difference is, I think this marriage is actually the best marriage we've seen.
Well, a couple of people we've talked to, one of whom is, I would consider, an expert in huaben. So this is probably the healthiest relationship you will see in any huaben.
Yeah. And, of course, the other difference is that both of the members in this relationship are born with penises.
Yeah.
And so that's really the only thing that's driving
It's the only thing, and the reason that's a funny detail is because it's a very funny detail. Li Yu knew how to make an audience laugh as well. I mean, in A Tower for the Summer Heat, having a telescope. So an amazing, incredible piece of technology. He's using it to check out girls. You know, that's funny. Here, this marriage, and it functions like a true marriage, down to Jifang being the good son-in-law and bringing the father of his now betrothed into the house to live. Everything is exactly the way you'd expect a marriage to be, except they're both
men,
right? And so
for a
while, and in that sense, Li Yu's kind of jabbing the audience a little bit, you know. So okay, so let's say we think about what a perfect marriage is. It has this and this and this and this and this. It has dedication, it has filiality. It has containment. It has fidelity. All of these things. Okay, fine. What if both of them are men? And of course, everyone begins to fidget because they think, well,
And, you know, we've talked about this issue of containment before as a part of the Huapen, and that's a theme in a lot of the theoretical literature. And one of the things I think that makes this story so interesting is containment doesn't really have... I mean, containment is an issue where, like... You know, ideally, you should not go to the bathroom. You should be 100% contained. Ideally, you should not have, you know, sexual relations with other people. You should be 100% contained. But containment can actually, in some ways, occur in a male-on-male relationship because there's no chance that... I mean, with a woman, there's always this chance that she can become uncontained. And then there's this question of the lineage of the son. I think that's the anxiety that's hanging over a lot of these traditional Huaben. We did Zhang Xingge and the Pearl Sewn Shirt, and I think that's like the classic Huaben where there's this question like, oh, if the woman, you know, exposes herself too much...
Exposes herself meaning open the window.
Yeah, open the window, yeah. Thank you. There is really a concern that, you know, the male lineage will be polluted. But the great thing about this relationship is that can't happen. So there's the drive for containment is somehow less of an issue. Like that's just, this is the one story I think that we've read, the one Huaben that we've read where containment's just not really a factor.
It's not breached. And it's interesting because what creates the drama in most of these Huaben is a breach of containment. This is a very common plot element. It's sort of analogous if you're watching a Western and an outlaw comes to town.
You always have to have the outlaw.
You gotta have an outlaw. You gotta have the shootout. It's genre fiction.
In Huaben, you always have to have the containment issue. You always
lots of containment or something. Now, there's a couple of maybe 2 or 3 themes, but one of those has to be there. In this one, there's not necessarily that.
And I think that's one of the interesting things about this story is it plays with the genre by defying genre expectations.
Right.
While putting everything about the genre, I mean, everything that we expect from the genre of Huaben is there, except for this.
Right. And so you can see the reading audience at that point going up to this moment of castration, not, let me say right before this, and thinking, okay, this is odd. It's funny because this isn't a marriage, and yet it's a marriage, at least in the ideal. It's the best marriage I've seen in stories, which is really weird. What's weirding me out is that the wife, quote unquote, is a boy. Okay, well, Li Yu says to the audience, let's remove the one impediment to considering this person a woman, which happens.
Yeah.
Now, the second half of the story is this person, this Ruiyang, behaving like a real wife, and at least if you accept the narrative sort of conceit here,
and it's in the title,
a woman.
Yeah, she is a woman, and she's not only behaving like a proper wife and a proper mother, but she's behaving like the best mother in Chinese literature. She's behaving like Mencius' mother, right? Like that's an explicit thing, and it almost kind of seems gimmicky in the plot, the way it's set up, because it's just like the plot contrives 2 different reasons that the man, now woman, named Ruiyang is moving.
Right.
And it's a definite metaphor. I mean, it's an explicit metaphor to Mencius' mother, who moved 3 times to get him into, I believe, the best school or something like and essentially like we're talking about the original Tiger Mom, And
That's a good comparison.
So Rainiang is being a tiger mom.
Yeah. And the moment that's this hinge point when Ruilang, becomes Ruinyang, the castration scene is fascinating because one of the great sins in filiality is if the lineage is cut off. Now, biologically, you literally don't have sons, or something happens, you are castrated. There's no worse sin in a filial culture than cutting off the lineage, and that is what Ruilang does to himself.
We should, just to contextualize this, there were, in Neo-Confucianism at least, this was taken so far that you couldn't cut your hair or your fingernails. Because those were given to you by your parents. And so that's combined with this need for sons. You have to give your father a son.
Right.
And so both of those, the greatest sin, the worst thing that can happen to you is that your plumbing gets cut off.
Right.
That's a huge thing because you're not able to have sons, and you're also like cutting off something that your father gave you, your parents gave you. So that's totally unfilial.
And what's fascinating about that, though, is it's the one thing that truly would keep someone from being filial. And yet, up to this point, Ruilang has been a very filial son.
Yeah, I mean, Ruilang plays the role of a good filial son because essentially he is sold to Jifang because because Jifang will give quite a bit of money so that his mother can be buried, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so he's doing a filial act. He's doing an unfilial act to perform a filial thing.
Right.
So we're already getting this sort of set up for the castration because the castration is sort of that writ large. Mm-hmm. But the castration moment is interesting because it's this question of a filial son versus being a good wife. Mm-hmm. Like he's playing both of these roles, which I think is fascinating. And then he eventually decides that he can't play both of them at the same time. But in a certain way, he is able to maintain that sort of tension throughout the story.
So he trades being a filial son for being an ideal wife.
And that's really the thing that defines this story.
Yeah. So what leads to Jifang's execution? Why is he executed?
We've completely forgotten about that. So Jifang is executed because it's discovered that I guess there were some rumors spreading about his relationship with Ruilang. And he's brought to court. He's brought to the Yamen, and they strip Ruilang. And we see this castration, and only the emperor, in Chinese law, only the emperor is allowed to do castration. Mm-hmm. It's not something that you can privately do.
Right.
And so for that crime, he is executed.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the end of his part in the story. But it also then allows now Ruinyang to be the ideal mother, the ideal wife. She doesn't. Mm-hmm. There's no record that she marries again.
No.
She treats her son the way Mencius' his mother. Amongst us, we say Mengzi. I don't know why we say Mencius. That's sort of a weird.
It's actually from Latin.
Is it from Latin?
Yeah. Confucius is also from Latin.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. I now remember that. But anyway, so we'll say Mencius because that's in the story title. Yeah. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. Mencius' mother is the same thing. Moves her son.
She's also a single mother.
So it's a fascinating bit of either satire or possibly both social commentary.
I think it's really both. One of the things I love about Huabun is that there's not this need to decide whether it's... I mean, there's a tension that can be maintained throughout the whole story. You don't have to come down on one end or the other. You can read it either way, and I think both are valid readings. And I think Li Yu knew that both were valid readings.
And Li Yu knew what story plots were really going to go to the audience, right? Mm-hmm. So here you have sort of a typical Huabun storyline, which is a question of fidelity or of a relationship functioning the way it's supposed to. Mm. The only difference is that there's really no way that this should be working the way it does, according to the reader of that time, but it is.
Yeah.
So the expectations are being toyed with here. Yeah. There's also Li Yu in a point when things in Chinese culture are becoming very fluid. the overturning of the Ming Dynasty, which would have come right at the point, either right before Liu started writing, or possibly at the same time, but I think right before, because I don't know exactly when his first Huabun was. But
I think this is several years after the establishment.
The Ming Dynasty has fallen. The Qing Dynasty has come in.
1644. Right. The Qing takes over all of China.
Right. As foreigners.
Well, they're Mencius.
I know that's a fluid question, but I'm saying they're
Mencius.
They're Mencius. They're definitely not the people that everyone is used to. So society is in flux. Things are anxious. People are anxious. Mm-hmm. And so you have a writer like Liu who sort of brings up, all right, well, if we're Chinese, and filial culture is what makes us Chinese possibly, what if you have someone who's very filial, except for this one thing? In a way
that's totally unfilial.
Very filial. Totally unfilial. And then what if you have the perfect wife in Confucian culture with the one proviso that the perfect wife didn't actually used to be a woman? Yeah. How does that work? And it's both funny and fairly poignant.
Yeah.
Because the reader has to grapple with the Chinese reader, at least at that time, would have had to grapple with some questions about, well, what do you do with this? And the funny thing is, even now, reading the story...
It seems almost contemporaneous.
It seems almost contemporary. You have to sort of grapple, if you're used to a certain idea of not just the way stories work, but the way marriages work. It's
particularly the way Chinese stories and Chinese marriages work.
Yes, exactly. It's still somewhat provocative.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it would be interesting to see this. I'd love to discuss this with Chinese friends back in the mainland.
Yeah. Sounds like a fun conversation to have over a beer.
I agree. Well, that's all I've got.
Yeah, I think that's great. I would just say, the main tension in the story for me is Rui Long being a filial son versus is Rui Niang being a proper Confucian wife.
And can you have both in the same person?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Before we go, I'd like to mention that for the reader who does not read Chinese, there is a Patrick Hannan translation.
Spelled Hanan.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And I thought it wasn't bad. I was using it just to help me with my Chinese when I kind of hit some spots I didn't understand. I would think definitely take a look at it if you get the chance.
Hannan is a great scholar on Huabun. Hannan is one of sort of the...
Hannan is the scholar.
He used to be. I think there are people who are, equally important now, but he's one of the ones that sort of blazed a trail in this. And he's still one of the best people to read and one of the best translators. So, for sure, if you're interested in any of these stories, take a look at some of his work.
He's the go-to guy.
He's the go-to guy, yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.